Today, we are going to explore a topic that has fascinated, terrified, and provoked countless theories and debates around the world for centuries. A figure shrouded in mystery and darkness, an entity that, according to the scriptures, will arise in the last days to deceive the nations and directly oppose all that is sacred and divine. Yes, we are talking about the Antichrist, but what do we really know about this figure? Is he merely a metaphor for evil, or is there something darker behind this legend? Join me as we delve into the depths of history, theology, and culture to unearth the most well-kept secrets about the Antichrist. To understand the Antichrist, we need to go back to the beginning. His first clear mention appears in the epistles of John, writings that date back to the end of the 1st century. These texts are direct, yet enigmatic. They not only identify the existence of an Antichrist, but also warn us that many Antichrists are already among us. Imagine living in that time. Christianity was in its early stages, still a young and persecuted religion. The fear of the end of the world was real and imminent, and the idea that an evil figure could emerge to destroy all that was sacred resonated deeply in the minds and hearts of those early Christians. In 1 John 2:18 we read, "Children, this is the last hour, and as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come, therefore we know that it is the last hour." Here, John presents us with the idea that the Antichrist is not just a single entity, but could be a series of individuals or forces that oppose Christ and his teachings. These words, filled with mystery, echoed through the centuries, creating an aura of fear and respect around the figure of the Antichrist. But who or what exactly is this Antichrist? Is he a person, a spirit, or something completely different? To answer this question, we need to explore another crucial part of the New Testament, the book of Revelation. This text, also known as the Revelation of John, is perhaps the most vivid and terrifying description of the end of times in the entire Bible. And although the term Antichrist is not directly mentioned in Revelation, we find a figure that many scholars identify as this entity, the beast. The beast, described in Revelation 13, is a creature that emerges from the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads and is given the power to rule the earth for 42 months. It is worshipped by many and persecutes the saints, those who keep their faith in God. The similarities with the Antichrist are undeniable. The vision of the beast was not just a metaphor, but a prophecy, a warning to the faithful that an evil force would rise in the last days to deceive and destroy. For centuries, this image was interpreted in various ways, with theologians and scholars trying to unravel what exactly this beast represented. Was it an oppressive government, a charismatic but corrupt leader, or something even more sinister? The answer to these questions varies, depending on whom you ask. In the early centuries of the Christian era, the Roman Empire, with its persecution of Christians, was often identified as the beast and the emperor as the Antichrist himself. And over time, this dark figure became associated with different historical characters, each seen as an incarnation of the supreme evil. But why this association? What is so powerful about the idea of the Antichrist that makes us look for him in every crisis, every tyrant, every great conflict? Perhaps it is the fear of the unknown, the terror of the chaos he represents, or simply the human need to personify evil so that we can confront it. Moving forward a few centuries, we come to the Middle Ages, a period where the idea of the Antichrist became even more solidified in the popular imagination. Medieval Europe was immersed in superstitions and fear of the end times, fueled by constant wars, plagues, and famine. In this environment of uncertainties, the figure of the Antichrist gained even more strength. In art, he was often depicted as a monstrous being, often with bestial traits, reflecting the anxieties of the time. The Church, in turn, used the threat of the Antichrist as a tool to maintain faith and discipline among the faithful, warning that he would arise to lead souls away from the path of salvation. The Gothic cathedrals of Europe, with their detailed sculptures and stained glass, often presented scenes of the Last Judgment, where the Antichrist played a central role. These images were not merely decorative. They served as constant reminders of the cosmic battle between good and evil, and of the role that each person had in this conflict. But the Antichrist was not just a distant threat. For many, he was always lurking, ready to emerge when the conditions were right. It was believed that he would come disguised, possibly as a charismatic leader who, instead of bringing peace, would spread chaos and destruction. This image of the Antichrist as a treacherous ruler persisted for centuries, but began to change during the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, one of the leading figures of the Reformation, was one of those who popularized the idea that the Antichrist was not just a future figure, but something much more present, the papacy itself. Luther and other reformers believed that the Catholic Church had strayed from the teachings of Christ and that the Pope was the Antichrist in person, leading the faithful away from the true faith. This idea further inflamed the tensions between Catholics and Protestants, leading to violent and lasting conflicts that shaped the course of European history. The vision of the Antichrist as an institutional figure, rather than a specific individual, marked a significant shift in theological thinking. Now the Antichrist could be seen in entire systems, not just in individual leaders. And this shift opened doors to countless interpretations over the following centuries. Over time, the concept of the Antichrist began to expand beyond the religious context, entering popular culture. Books, movies, and even modern conspiracy theories explore the idea of a global leader, or even a new world order, that would bring chaos and the end of civilization as we know it. And so we come to the present. Today, the Antichrist is a figure that continues to fascinate and frighten, not just as a theological character, but as a symbol of absolute evil. Whether in works of fiction or political speeches, he represents our worst fears, the forces that seem beyond our control. But perhaps, deep down, the Antichrist is more than just a simple entity. Perhaps he represents the eternal conflict within ourselves, between light and darkness, between good and evil. And in this battle, each of us plays a role, deciding every day which side will prevail. Let us now delve deeper into the historical context in which the epistles of John were written. Imagine a world where the Roman Empire dominated much of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. It was a time of great uncertainty for Christians who lived under the constant threat of persecution. John's words, when mentioning the Antichrist, were not just spiritual warnings, but also a response to the political and social environment in which he and his followers were immersed. By talking about the Antichrist, John was, in part, preparing the Christian community for the challenges to come. He describes the Antichrist as one who denies that Jesus is the Christ. But what does this mean for us today? Is the Antichrist just a historical figure? Or does he continue to influence us in subtle and unexpected ways? To better understand this figure, we need to consider the apocalyptic context of the New Testament. In the book of Revelation, we find vivid descriptions of the end times, including the famous beast. The beast, for many scholars, is a representation of the Antichrist. But what makes this figure so terrifying? Is it just his appearance, or is there something deeper at play? The beast is described with characteristics that evoke chaos and destruction. Its 7 heads and 10 horns are not just symbols of power, but of corrupt and malevolent power. And this power, according to the scriptures, will be worshipped by many. Here we see a clear parallel with the idea of the Antichrist as a deceiver, someone who seduces the masses and leads them away from the truth. As Christianity spread across Europe during the Middle Ages, the figure of the Antichrist became increasingly central in the Church's preachings and teachings. The apocalyptic fears that had haunted the early Christians continued to evolve, taking on new forms as Europe faced periods of crisis, such as the Black Plague and constant wars. During this time, the Church used the threat of the Antichrist as a powerful tool to keep the faithful in check. Sermons often described the Antichrist as a figure who would arise in the last days to lead lost souls to destruction. These descriptions were not just allegories, they were considered very real warnings. Imagine being a medieval peasant living in a small village, hearing Sunday sermons about the Antichrist. The fear of the unknown, of the uncertain future, and the belief that the end was always lurking shaped every aspect of daily life. But the Antichrist was not just a figure to be feared, he was also a way for the Church to explain evil in the world. When bad things happened, such as natural disasters or invasions, these tragedies were often interpreted as signs of the Antichrist's proximity. He was seen as the personification of all the evils that afflicted humanity. And so, this dark figure began to appear not only in the words of priests, but also in art, literature, and architecture. The cathedrals, with their grotesque sculptures and elaborate stained glass windows, often depicted scenes of the Last Judgment, where the Antichrist played a central role. These images were not just meant to inspire fear, but also to teach and warn the faithful about the spiritual dangers that awaited them. The vision of the Antichrist began to change with the arrival of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, one of the most influential leaders of the Reformation, made a bold statement. He identified the papacy as the Antichrist. This marked a dramatic shift in how the Antichrist was viewed, shifting from a future and apocalyptic figure to a direct critique of the established power of the Catholic Church. Luther and other reformers saw the Pope as someone who had corrupted the teachings of Christ and by doing so had become the very Antichrist. For them, the papacy not only led souls away from the path of salvation, but also represented everything that was wrong with Christianity at the time. This accusation was not just a theological dispute, it ignited a conflict that would spread across Europe, leading to wars, religious divisions, and the formation of new Christian denominations. The Antichrist, who had once been seen as a distant and future enemy, was now identified in the present, in the leaders and institutions that dominated the religious and political landscape. But this idea of the Antichrist as an institutional figure did not disappear with the Reformation. In fact, it continued to evolve in the following centuries, influencing how people viewed power and corruption. And as history progressed, the concept of the Antichrist began to expand beyond the religious context. In modern times, the Antichrist is often seen as a metaphor for corrupt leaders, oppressive systems, and even the threat of a new world order. In movies and books, he appears as a global ruler who brings destruction and chaos. These stories resonate because they speak to our deepest fears. The fear of losing control, the fear of being deceived, the fear that evil will triumph over good. But do these representations of the Antichrist reflect reality, or are they just projections of our fears? And what does this tell us about human nature and our need to create enemies to confront? Perhaps the Antichrist is less about a specific figure and more about the eternal struggle within each of us, between good and evil, between light and darkness. The apocalyptic prophecies. As we move forward in our exploration, it is impossible to ignore the impact of apocalyptic prophecies on perceptions of the Antichrist. These prophecies, especially those found in the Book of Revelation, not only shaped Christian theology, but also had a profound effect on culture and politics throughout the centuries. In Revelation, we find a vivid description of the end times, where the Antichrist, often identified with the beast, plays a crucial role. He is the great deceiver, the final adversary, who will gather armies to challenge God himself in a final battle. But these prophecies are not just about destruction and despair. They also speak of redemption and hope for those who remain faithful. Let's focus on the different interpretations of these prophecies. For example, some believe that the Antichrist will be a powerful political leader, someone who will bring a false peace before revealing his true nature. Others see the Antichrist as a spiritual or ideological force that will pervert the truth and seduce the masses. This diversity of interpretations reflects the complexity of the scriptures and the depth of human anxieties. In times of crisis, it is common for people to look for signs of the end, and the Antichrist becomes a central figure in this search. But what do these interpretations tell us about our own nature? Are we always looking for a villain, someone or something to blame for our problems? Today, apocalyptic prophecies continue to capture the popular imagination. Books like Left Behind and movies like The Omen perpetuate the idea that the Antichrist is among us, preparing for a final confrontation. But these fictional scenarios also raise questions about our perception of evil and power. Are we so focused on identifying the Antichrist that we lose sight of the real ethical and moral challenges we face? The figure of the Antichrist, with all its complexity, forces us to confront deep questions about power, morality, and human destiny. He challenges us to reflect on what it means to be deceived, on the nature of evil, and on the role of faith in the struggle against forces that seek to destroy what is good and just. But what is truly fascinating about these prophecies is how they are interpreted in such different ways, depending on the context. For example, in some cultures, the Antichrist is seen as a figure of global power and influence, someone who will manipulate politics and the economy for his own ends. In others, he is seen as a spiritual threat, an invisible force that corrupts souls. And then, there are those who believe that the Antichrist is not a person or an external force, but something within each of us. A struggle between good and evil, a moral battle that we all face daily. This idea that the Antichrist may be a part of our own nature is both terrifying and enlightening. As we look at the impact of the Antichrist on popular culture, we see that this figure continues to influence not only religious thought, but also art, literature, and even politics. In movies, he is often portrayed as a charismatic but sinister leader, someone who, with a smile, can convince the masses to follow a path of destruction. In literature, the Antichrist is a constant presence, symbolizing the struggle between civilization and chaos, between moral order and corruption. These stories force us to confront our own fears and uncertainties, challenging us to think about what it really means to live in a world where evil may always be lurking, ready to strike. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of this figure is how it adapts to the times. The Antichrist, as a concept, evolves with society, reflecting our deepest fears and anxieties. He is, in many ways, a mirror of our own insecurities, a constant reminder that evil, whether external or internal, is always present, and that the struggle to overcome it is eternal. It is interesting to observe how, over the centuries, the Antichrist has been adapted to fit the concerns and challenges of each era. In the Middle Ages, he was primarily seen as a spiritual threat, someone who would bring the damnation of souls through heresy and deception. In the modern age, with the rise of nation-states and the growing influence of global politics, the Antichrist began to be associated with corrupt and tyrannical leaders. This continuous adaptation is no coincidence. It reflects how the concept of the Antichrist serves as a barometer for social and political anxieties. When people fear moral corruption, the Antichrist emerges as a religious or spiritual leader who leads souls astray. When the fear is political, he appears as an oppressive ruler, someone who threatens freedom and justice. In today's world, the Antichrist continues to be a powerful figure in popular culture, but he has also become something more complex. In a world where the boundaries between good and evil are not always clear, the Antichrist can be seen as a symbol of moral ambiguities and ethical dilemmas that we face. Consider, for example, the numerous films and series that explore the idea of a charismatic leader who, under a facade of benevolence, hides malicious intentions. These stories resonate because they capture something deep about the human condition, the fear of being deceived, of being led down a path that seems righteous but leads to ruin. But what makes the Antichrist so fascinating is that he is not just a figure of fear, he also represents a warning. He reminds us that evil can disguise itself as good and that it is our responsibility to be vigilant, discerning between what is true and what is false. In addition to his presence in theology and popular culture, the Antichrist has also been the subject of analysis by psychologists and philosophers. Carl Jung, for example, interpreted the Antichrist as an archetypal shadow, a representation of the repressed and unacknowledged parts of the human psyche. According to Jung, the Antichrist symbolizes the dark side of humanity, the side we deny and project onto others. This view is powerful because it suggests that the Antichrist is not just an external figure, but a part of each of us. He represents our destructive impulses, our selfish desires, and our potential for evil. And by confronting this shadow within us, we can begin to understand and perhaps even overcome the forces that lead us to act against our own interests and against the common good. This philosophical perspective raises profound questions about the nature of evil and morality. Is the Antichrist just a projection of our fears and repressed desires, or is he something more? And if he is an inescapable part of the human condition, what does that mean for our quest for goodness and truth? Philosophy offers us many ways to think about these questions. Some argue that evil, personified by the Antichrist, is a necessary part of existence, a counterpoint to good that challenges us to grow and evolve. Others see the Antichrist as a symbol of chaos, a force that threatens to destroy the order and harmony that we so value. But regardless of how we interpret the Antichrist, what is clear is that he remains a central figure in our reflections on life, morality, and destiny. He forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world we live in, and challenges us to find ways to resist evil, both within and outside of us. While the Antichrist is a figure largely associated with Christianity, he is not exclusive to this religion. Different cultures and spiritual traditions have their own concepts of a figure or force that opposes good and threatens cosmic order. In Islam, for example, there is the figure of Al-Masih ad-Dajjal, a false messiah who deceives the faithful and leads humanity to destruction. Like the Christian Antichrist, the Dajjal is seen as a powerful deceiver who will arise in the last days to wage a final battle against the forces of good. In Eastern traditions, we find concepts such as Mara in Buddhism, an entity that tempts Buddha with promises of power and pleasure, trying to divert him from his path to enlightenment. Although not exactly an Antichrist, Mara represents the forces of desire and illusion that oppose the quest for truth and enlightenment. These figures and concepts show that the struggle between good and evil, truth and illusion, is a universal theme, present in many cultures and traditions, and the Antichrist, under different names and forms, continues to be a powerful symbol of this eternal struggle. The parallels between the Antichrist and other mythological figures lead us to a deeper reflection on the role that these figures play in our lives. They are not just personifications of evil, but they also reflect our deepest concerns and fears. In many mythologies, we find heroes who face evil forces, monsters, or gods that threaten to destroy the world or divert humanity from the right path. These myths offer us a way to understand evil and to prepare to face it. The Antichrist, in this sense, is part of a long tradition of figures representing chaos, destruction, and the need to struggle to preserve what is good and just. But at the same time, these figures remind us that evil is not something that can be easily defeated. It is persistent, always resurfacing in new forms, requiring constant vigilance and a commitment to truth and justice. And perhaps that is what makes the Antichrist as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. He challenges us to be better, not to succumb to despair, and to fight for a better world. As we explore these representations of the Antichrist and his counterparts in other cultures, we realize that this figure functions not only as a warning against evil, but also as a mirror of society. In each era and in each cultural context, the Antichrist adapts, reflecting the fears and anxieties of the time. In Hinduism, for example, there is the concept of Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and moral decay that precedes cosmic renewal. During this period, destructive forces gain power and corruption and violence spread. While there is no specific figure equivalent to the Antichrist, the concept of Kali Yuga encapsulates the idea of a time when evil dominates, similar to what many believe to be the role of the Antichrist in the end times. This idea of an age of darkness before renewal or salvation is a common theme in many spiritual traditions. The Antichrist, therefore, can be seen as a manifestation of these forces of destruction, a sign that order needs to be restored through a final battle, whether physical, spiritual, or moral. Let's now consider how the idea of the Antichrist has transcended the religious realm to influence politics and society. Throughout history, charismatic leaders, political movements, and even entire nations have been labeled as antichrists, especially in times of crisis or change. During World War II, for example, Adolf Hitler was often compared to the Antichrist both by religious leaders and prominent thinkers. His rise to power, the manipulation of the masses, and the devastation he caused were seen as evidence that he could be the embodiment of this supreme evil. This association was not unique. Leaders like Napoleon and Stalin were also compared to the Antichrist in their respective historical periods. These comparisons are not just rhetorical exercises. They reflect a deep human need to understand and categorize evil in terms that are comprehensible and that allow us to mobilize a response. By identifying historical figures with the Antichrist, societies have attempted, in part, to justify the struggle against these forces, both morally and practically. In the modern era, with the advancement of globalization and technology, the concept of the Antichrist continues to evolve. Today, he is not just a figure who leads nations, but he can also be seen as a force that permeates global systems, the economy, international politics, even mass culture. Some conspiracy theorists argue that the Antichrist may manifest through a new world order, an entity that would control all aspects of human life, from finances to religious beliefs. These theories, though often discredited, reflect very real fears about the loss of control, mass manipulation, and the destruction of individuality and freedom. These ideas may seem exaggerated, but they touch on a raw nerve, the fear that forces beyond our control may lead us into an age of tyranny and oppression. And once again, the Antichrist emerges as the personification of these fears, a symbol of the supreme evil that threatens not just individuals, but entire civilization. With the advancement of technology, especially in the area of artificial intelligence and digital control, new interpretations of the Antichrist have begun to emerge. Some speculate that the Antichrist could take the form of an extremely advanced artificial intelligence capable of manipulating, controlling, and even replacing humanity. This view is not merely science fiction. It reflects very real concerns about the power of technology in our lives. As we become increasingly dependent on digital systems, social networks, and algorithms, The fear that these systems could be used to control us or even destroy us becomes more palpable. Will the Antichrist of the future be a human being, or will he be a creation of humanity itself, a product of our insatiable quest for power and control? This question opens up a new field of reflection where theology, philosophy, and science meet to debate what it means to be human in an age of intelligent machines and almost limitless technological powers. Beyond technological concerns, the concept of the Antichrist also leads us to reflect on ethical and moral issues in the contemporary world. As society becomes more complex, the distinctions between good and evil, right and wrong, often become blurred. The Antichrist, as a symbol, challenges us to reconsider these distinctions, especially when faced with difficult ethical dilemmas. For example, in a world where information can be easily manipulated and where truth becomes a contested commodity, the Antichrist can be seen as a metaphor for the age of misinformation. He represents the force that distorts reality, that turns falsehood into truth and truth into falsehood, and that uses this confusion to consolidate power. This raises crucial questions about individual and collective responsibility. If the Antichrist is, in part, a product of our own actions and decisions, then the fight against him is not just a matter of faith, but also of ethics. We need to ask ourselves, how can we live in a way that resists the temptation to distort the truth? How can we act in a way that builds a more just and honest world, even in the face of forces that seek to deceive and corrupt? And, in the end, the Antichrist forces us to confront one of the most fundamental questions of human existence, the search for meaning. In a world where evil seems to be a constant and inevitable force, how do we find purpose and meaning? The Antichrist, as a symbol of supreme evil, reminds us that the fight for good is not easy, but it is essential. This struggle is, in many ways, what defines the human condition. By resisting evil, by seeking the truth, and by trying to live justly, we not only confront the Antichrist, whether he is a literal or symbolic figure, but we also define who we are and what we believe in. And it is in this continuous struggle between good and evil that we find the true meaning of our existence. The Antichrist, then, is not just a figure of fear or evil. He is also a challenge, an invitation for all of us to reflect on what it means to live with integrity and meaning in a world full of complexities and contradictions. As we move forward in our exploration, we must consider how the figure of the Antichrist also serves as a kind of universal antagonist, a force that exists not just to destroy, but to test, purify, and ultimately strengthen. In many traditions, the confrontation with evil is seen as a necessary process for spiritual and moral growth. And in this context, the Antichrist can be seen as a paradoxical tool that, in trying to corrupt and deceive, ends up driving humanity to seek the truth with more fervor. This idea is not new. Philosophers and theologians throughout the centuries have discussed the role of evil as a catalyst for good. St. Augustine, for example, argued that evil exists as a way to test faith and virtue. For him, evil is not an autonomous force, but rather the absence of good, a distortion of the natural order that, paradoxically, can lead souls to become purer by resisting it. This point of view raises fascinating questions about the nature of good and evil. If evil, personified by the Antichrist, is a test or challenge, then the fight against it is not just an external battle, but also an internal one. Every time we resist evil, we affirm our own morality, our ability to choose good. But this struggle also reveals the fragility of the human condition. The idea that the Antichrist can arise from within us as a result of our own choices and actions forces us to confront our own limits and failures. Are we, in fearing the Antichrist, really fearing our own capacity to fall into temptation, to choose the wrong path. This reflection is crucial because it reminds us that the Antichrist, in all its forms, is also a reflection of humanity. He is a manifestation of our deepest fears, our darkest desires, and our continuous struggle to rise above these tendencies. Literature and art throughout the centuries have powerfully captured this duality of the Antichrist as a figure that, at the same time, represents absolute evil and the ultimate challenge. Literary works such as Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy and John Milton's Paradise Lost explore the role of evil in creating meaning and in the spiritual journey. In The Divine Comedy, for example, Dante describes the descent into hell as a necessary journey to understand the nature of sin and redemption. At the bottom of hell, he finds Lucifer, whom many interpret as a representation of the Antichrist, trapped in ice, powerless and distant from God. This image is not just a condemnation, but also a reminder that evil, in the end, is self-destructive. The Antichrist, thus, is portrayed not just as a threat, but as a being ultimately destined to fail. Milton, in turn, in Paradise Lost, presents Satan, who has been compared to the Antichrist, as a tragic figure whose rebellion against God results in his own fall. Here, the Antichrist is a symbol of pride and unbridled ambition, a warning about the dangers of challenging the divine order. In visual art, the Antichrist has been depicted in equally complex and multifaceted ways. Paintings, sculptures, and illustrations throughout history have captured the Antichrist as a figure of terror, but also as a presence that evokes reflection on human nature. Renaissance artists like Hieronymus Bosch, for example, used apocalyptic scenes to represent the chaos and destruction that the Antichrist would bring. His works are rich in symbolic detail, showing not just the fear of final judgment, but also humanity's internal struggle against its own demons. These artistic representations force us to visually confront what words often try to express. The Antichrist is not just an external entity, but also an internal force, a representation of the conflicts and contradictions that we all carry within ourselves. In modern times, cinema and television have become the new fields where the figure of the Antichrist is explored and reinterpreted. Films like Rosemary's Baby and The Omen popularized the idea that the Antichrist could be born among us, growing in secret until the moment of revealing his true nature. These films capture the fear of the unknown, of the evil that may be hidden beneath the surface of normality. They play with the idea that the Antichrist could be anyone, even a member of our own family. This concept is especially disturbing because it suggests that evil is not something distant or easily identifiable, but something that can infiltrate our lives in a subtle and insidious way. But these films also raise important questions about the nature of innocence and guilt. Is the Antichrist born evil, or does he become evil because of the circumstances surrounding him? This question, explored in various narratives, challenges us to reconsider our own assumptions about evil, human nature, and the role of society in shaping character. With the rise of the digital age, the concept of the Antichrist has found new ways to manifest. Social media, for example, has been a fertile ground for the dissemination of conspiracy theories, many of which identify political leaders, public figures, or even celebrities as the Antichrist. These theories reflect growing skepticism and distrust of traditional institutions and the media. The Antichrist, in these narratives, is not just a villain, but a symbol of the forces that many believe are corrupting truth and manipulating reality for their own ends. These ideas, as extreme as they may seem, reveal an underlying truth. The Antichrist, as a concept, adapts to the needs and concerns of each era. He is a reflection of contemporary fears, fear of centralized power, digital manipulation, and the loss of control over our own lives. And finally, the Antichrist also plays a crucial role in shaping collective identity. By identifying an other as the Antichrist, whether he is a historical figure, an institution, or even an ideology, societies often unite around a common cause. This dynamic can be both unifying and dangerous. On the one hand, the Antichrist can serve as a symbol that helps define a community's values, clearly delineating what is good and what is evil. On the other hand, this identification can lead to polarization, demonization of the other, and justification of actions that, under normal circumstances, would be considered unacceptable. This tension between the need for collective identity and the danger of exclusion and intolerance is one of the many ways in which the Antichrist continues to influence the modern world. He forces us to ask, how can we create a just and inclusive society without falling into the trap of demonizing those who are different from us? How can we resist evil without becoming what we fear? As we move into the 21st century, the figure of the Antichrist remains a symbolic presence that challenges us to reflect on the directions we are taking as a civilization. In a world where the boundaries between good and evil seem increasingly blurred, the Antichrist becomes a reminder that the danger is not always obvious, not always manifesting itself in a clear and distinct way. In a global scenario where technology advances rapidly, altering the way we live, work, and relate, new questions arise about how these changes can be exploited by forces that resemble the Antichrist. If, as some fear, digital control and artificial intelligence can be used to manipulate and subjugate populations, then the Antichrist could very well manifest not as a person, but as a system, a network of control that infiltrates every aspect of life. These reflections lead us to an intersection between ethics, technology, and spirituality. What does it mean, after all, to create such powerful technologies? What are the responsibilities that accompany these creations? And how can we ensure that these tools are used for good rather than becoming instruments of oppression? The debate about the Antichrist and technological ethics is crucial, especially in an age where decisions about artificial intelligence, surveillance, and privacy are shaping the future of humanity. If the Antichrist is a metaphor for supreme evil, then the real challenge lies in how we prevent our technological innovations from being used for malicious purposes. History shows us that power, when concentrated and unchecked, tends to corrupt. The Antichrist, as a symbol of this corrupted power, warns us about the dangers of allowing technology, unchecked and unregulated, to be used to control and manipulate society in ways that were previously unimaginable. This leads us to an important reflection. How do we balance technological progress with the preservation of individual and collective freedom? How do we prevent the pursuit of efficiency and convenience from leading us to create systems that ultimately destroy the very essence of what it means to be human? The question of human freedom is central to the narrative of the Antichrist. In many traditions, the Antichrist is seen as the usurper of freedom, the one who tries to impose his will on others, manipulating and deceiving to achieve his goals. But resistance to the Antichrist in all its forms is also an affirmation of freedom, the freedom to choose good, to resist oppression, and to live according to moral and ethical principles. In the modern era, this struggle for freedom takes on new forms. In a world where choices seem increasingly controlled by algorithms and where information is carefully curated by digital systems, true freedom requires vigilance and awareness. The fight against the Antichrist, therefore, is not just a spiritual battle, but also a fight for autonomy, for the right to think, decide, and act independently. This idea is particularly relevant at a time when democracy and human rights are under pressure in many parts of the world. The Antichrist, as a symbol of tyranny and control, challenges us to defend these fundamental values, even when circumstances seem to conspire against them. The narratives of resistance to the Antichrist are as old as the figure itself. From the early Christians who resisted the Roman Empire to contemporary resistance movements that oppose authoritarian regimes, the fight against the Antichrist has been interpreted as a struggle for human dignity and justice. These stories of resistance are inspiring because they show that even in the face of supreme evil, the human spirit is capable of fighting and prevailing. They remind us that the strength of the Antichrist does not lie solely in his power or influence, but also in our willingness to succumb to fear and despair. Resisting the Antichrist, therefore, is an act of courage, a testament to our commitment to truth and justice, even in the most difficult circumstances. These stories also offer us a vision of hope. The Antichrist, ultimately, is a defeated figure. He may cause suffering and destruction, but he cannot prevail against those who maintain faith, hope, and courage. And it is this message of hope that continues to resonate through the centuries, inspiring new generations to resist evil wherever it may manifest. In addition to the great narratives of resistance, the Antichrist also challenges us to consider our own personal spirituality. He forces us to reflect on the temptations and challenges we face in our own lives and how we choose to respond to them. The figure of the Antichrist, as we have seen, can be interpreted as a representation of the internal obstacles that we all face: selfishness, greed, vanity. These are the internal antichrists that can lead us away from the right path, leading us to make decisions that harm ourselves and others. Confronting these dark aspects of our own nature is an essential part of the spiritual journey. It is a process that requires honesty, introspection, and often repentance, but it is also a process that can lead to transformation, growth, and renewal. By confronting the Antichrist within us, we have the opportunity to become stronger, more just, and more compassionate people. And finally, the Antichrist leads us to the theme of redemption. In many traditions, the Antichrist is a figure that, though powerful and terrible, is destined for defeat. This defeat is often seen as a necessary part of the process of redemption, a purification through which good triumphs over evil. This idea of redemption is central to many religious and spiritual beliefs. It reminds us that, no matter the difficulties and challenges we face, there is the possibility of renewal and restoration. The Antichrist, in his defeat, is not just a symbol of the evil that is overcome, but also of the good that is affirmed, renewed, and strengthened. On a personal level, this redemption can mean overcoming our own internal demons, returning to the path of truth and justice, and renewing our commitment to what is good and true. It is a reminder that, even in the darkest hours, there is always the possibility of redemption and a new beginning. The idea of redemption, so central to the understanding of the Antichrist, leads us to consider the role of forgiveness, both on an individual and collective level. If the Antichrist symbolizes supreme evil, then the ability to forgive and to be forgiven becomes a powerful act of resistance against that evil. Forgiveness, in many spiritual traditions, is seen as a path to healing, both for the one who forgives and the one who is forgiven. However, forgiveness in the face of evil is one of the most complex and challenging issues we can face. How do we forgive those who seem irreparably corrupted or who have caused immense harm? And more importantly, how do we forgive ourselves for our own failures and mistakes? These are the dilemmas that the Antichrist, as a figure of evil, forces us to confront. History is full of examples of figures who, when confronted with evil, chose the path of forgiveness. Think of figures like Nelson Mandela, who after decades of injustice chose to forgive his oppressors as an act of national reconciliation. These choices not only challenged the power of evil, but also transformed entire societies, showing that redemption is possible even in the most difficult contexts. The Antichrist, in representing evil in its purest form, also plays a crucial role in character building. By confronting evil, we are forced to define what we truly value, to decide who we want to be, and what kind of world we want to contribute to. This character building is a process that requires continuous reflection and courage. The Antichrist, with his temptations and challenges, tests our ability to maintain our integrity in the face of adversity. And it is through these trials that character is forged, not just as a response to evil, but as an affirmation of good. Think of the choices we make every day, being honest when it would be easier to lie, being just when it would be easier to exploit, being compassionate when it would be easier to be indifferent. Each of these choices contributes to character building and at the same time represents a form of resistance to the Antichrist within and outside of us. The concept of sacrifice is another profound theme that the Antichrist forces us to consider. In many traditions, the defeat of the Antichrist and the redemption that follows is not achieved without sacrifice. Sacrifice in this context is seen as an act of love and selflessness, an offering that seeks the greater good, even at the cost of personal pain. This idea of sacrifice is present in many religious and mythological stories. In Christianity, for example, the sacrifice of Christ on the cross is seen as the ultimate act of love and redemption, a victory over sin and death which the Antichrist symbolizes. This sacrifice is not just a response to evil, but also an affirmation of the power of good, love, and justice. On a personal level, sacrifice can take many forms. Giving up something we value to help others, enduring hardships in the name of a just cause, or even sacrificing our own safety and comfort to stand up for what is right. These acts, as small as they may seem, are ways of resisting evil and affirming our humanity in the face of the challenges that the Antichrist represents. Hope is perhaps the most essential element in the fight against the Antichrist. In many stories, the Antichrist is described as a force that sows despair, that leads people to believe that the struggle is futile, that evil has already won. But the true victory over the Antichrist is not just in defeating him, but in keeping hope alive, even in the darkest circumstances. This hope is not a naive optimism, but a deep conviction that good, despite all obstacles, has the power to prevail. Hope gives us the strength to keep fighting, to resist the temptation of despair, and to believe that, in the end, justice will be done. In practice, hope manifests itself in acts of kindness, in gestures of solidarity, in words of encouragement. Every time we choose hope over despair, we are resisting the Antichrist and affirming our faith in the possibility of a better world. And this resistance, no matter how small it may seem, is a powerful way to transform reality. The confrontation with the Antichrist, whether it is an external force or an internal battle, is often a catalyst for personal transformation. In many stories, those who face the Antichrist emerge transformed, stronger and wiser than they were before. This transformation is not just about overcoming evil, but about discovering new truths about oneself and the world. This idea of personal transformation is central to many spiritual and philosophical traditions. It suggests that evil, though destructive, can be a harsh teacher, teaching us valuable lessons about resilience, courage, and compassion. And by facing and overcoming these challenges, we become more than we were before. This transformation can be seen in many aspects of life. When we overcome a difficulty, whether it is physical, emotional, or spiritual, we emerge stronger, with a new understanding of what we are capable of enduring and what really matters. And it is this transformation that ultimately prepares us to face new challenges with more wisdom and confidence. The role of community in the fight against the Antichrist cannot be underestimated. In many traditions, resistance to evil is not seen as an individual effort, but as a collective one. The community offers support, strength, and wisdom, helping to resist the temptations and challenges that the Antichrist brings. The idea of community is central because it reminds us that we are not alone in the fight against evil. By coming together, we can share strengths, exchange experiences, and support each other in times of difficulty. This solidarity is a powerful weapon against the despair and division that the Antichrist seeks to sow. Communities, whether religious, social, or familial, play a vital role in maintaining morality and justice. They are spaces where values are taught, where truth is defended, and where good is cultivated. And it is through these communities that resistance to the Antichrist can be strengthened and sustained over time. The strength of a united community is fundamental in the resistance to evil represented by the Antichrist. When we unite around shared values, such as justice, truth, and compassion, we create a collective defense against the forces that seek to corrupt and divide. The community serves as a refuge, a place where individuals can support each other, especially in times of crisis and uncertainty. In history, we see powerful examples of communities coming together to resist evil. During World War II, for example, entire communities united to protect the persecuted and resist Nazism, which many saw as a manifestation of the Antichrist in its time. These actions were not just acts of resistance, they were expressions of a deep faith in goodness and human dignity. This solidarity, this ability to unite in the face of evil, is what makes communities so resilient. The Antichrist, with all his power, cannot easily defeat a community united around moral and spiritual values. And it is this collective strength that is often the decisive factor in the fight against evil. As we conclude our exploration of the Antichrist, it is important to reflect on the legacy that this figure leaves in culture and spirituality. The Antichrist, over the centuries, has been more than just a figure of fear and destruction. He has been a symbol of resistance, of the fight for truth, and of a constant challenge to our morality and integrity. In culture, the Antichrist continues to be a powerful symbol that reflects the anxieties and challenges of each era. From the earliest representations in the scriptures to the modern interpretations in cinema and literature, the Antichrist serves as a mirror that shows us not only the evil in the world, but also our capacity to confront and overcome it. In spirituality, the Antichrist represents the continuous struggle between good and evil, a struggle that is not just external, but also internal. He forces us to confront our own failures, our own demons, and to constantly seek redemption and transformation. This struggle, though difficult, is what defines the human condition and what drives us to seek what is just, true, and good. And so, we come to the end of this chapter on the Antichrist, a figure who, despite his dark nature, offers us profound lessons about life, morality, and spirituality. The Antichrist, in all his manifestations, challenges us to be vigilant, to resist evil, and to unite around good. But perhaps the greatest lesson we can take from this exploration is that while the Antichrist is a powerful force, he is not invincible. With courage, faith, and the strength of community, we can resist his temptations and defeat his influences, not just in the world, but also within ourselves. May we then carry these lessons forward, always remembering that the fight against evil is a collective responsibility, but also a personal journey. And that, in the end, the power of good, truth, and justice will prevail, no matter how strong or insidious the Antichrist may seem.